Hi, I'm Michael Correa, and this is Psych Exam Review. In this video, I'm going to explain the process of transduction for sound. So, how do we go from sound waves around us in the air to brain activity inside our head that tells us what sounds we're hearing? Well, in order to understand this, we're going to have to look at the parts of the ear and describe what each part does. So, here's a diagram of an ear, and we start with the sort of fleshy outer part of the ear that's sticking out of your head here, and it's essentially a funnel. And this catches sounds, or it helps to catch the sounds around you. So sounds are directed through this funnel, the pinna, into the auditory canal. And when they get to the end of the auditory canal, what happens is they vibrate the eardrum. So the eardrum is this thin, stretched piece of skin, essentially. You can also call it the tympanic membrane. And so the sound waves actually cause that to move. And when the eardrum moves, it vibrates these bones that are behind us. Now we're in the inner ear. And these bones are called the ossicles, and this is Latin for little bones. And these are the smallest bones in your body. So you have 3 of these in each of your ears. And so what happens is the hammer hits the anvil then vibrates the stirrup, and now the sort of interesting part of what happens to the vibration occurs at the cochlea. So the cochlea is this spiral, curled up structure, and cochlea is Latin for snail, because this looks a lot like a snail. And so what happens in the cochlea is that it has a structure called the basilar membrane, and it's essentially a long, rolled up tube, and it's filled with fluid. And when the stirrup vibrates, that sends waves of vibration through the fluid. And then, lining the basilar membrane are little tiny hair cells. These are called stereocilia. And these little hair cells are moved, right? They sort of blow in the breeze of the fluid moving, and when they move, they trigger neurons to fire. So then those messages get sent out the auditory nerve, and then they go to the brain. So they go to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus, they go out to the temporal lobes on either side of your brain, where we have the primary auditory cortex, or the area called A1. Right? And this is the area that begins processing these sounds to figure out what they are. Okay, so let's talk about this area of the cochlea in a little more detail. Before I close this picture, you probably noticed there's a section called the Vestibular System next to the cochlea here. And this actually has nothing to do with hearing. So I'm going to talk about this in a future video. This has to do with your sense of balance. And so it works in a similar way. It's filled with fluid, but it doesn't have to do with hearing. So I'm not going to go into detail in this video. Okay, so let's imagine that we unraveled the cochlea here, right? So we have this sort of long section here. This is probably not the best drawing of it. And it's filled with fluid, and it's lined by these little tiny hair cells. So these are the stereocilia. And this, sorry, I should have written, is the basilar membrane. Right, so an important idea for understanding the basilar membrane is that when the fluid moves, different wavelengths, different frequencies of sound are going to stimulate different areas of the basilar membrane. And the way that it works is that very high pitches stimulate the hair cells at the beginning of the basilar membrane, right, near the stirrup, and then the low frequency sounds do most of the stimulation at the lower end of, or the end of the basilar membrane, right? And so this is an idea called place code. So this is the idea that part of the way we know what frequency we're hearing, how high pitched a sound is actually physically in our basilar membrane. Where are the hair cells moving? If they're moving here, it's a high pitched sound. If they're moving here, it's a low pitched sound. If they're somewhere in the middle, it's somewhere in the middle. So that's place code. It's the idea that it's the location of the stereocilia. The location of the hair cells that move tells us about the pitch. This isn't the only way that we know about pitch. It's combined with another approach called temporal code. So the temporal code is the idea that, well, the neurons that are sending these messages can fire at different rates. And so the idea of temporal code is that different frequencies can stimulate these neurons to fire at different rates. Now, initially, this idea was kind of dismissed because people said, well, we can hear very high pitches, 20,000 hertz, right? That's very, very fast vibration, and our neurons can't keep up. We don't have neurons that can fire 20,000 times a second. So how could we possibly use temporal code? And then the idea was, well, actually, you don't need to have neurons that fire 20,000 times per second. If you have neurons that can fire about 1,000 times per second, which is about the fastest that we have neurons that can fire, well, if you have 20 of them and you stagger their firing, right, you have a sort of synchronized pattern of firing across a group of neurons, then you can actually tell about very, very different rates of frequency. Right? You can actually get up to, telling about something that's 20,000 hertz based on that. So the idea of temporal code has to do with the firing rate. And so the idea is that we use a combination of both of these, and the information then gets to our temporal lobe where it's processed, where we then sort of have the role of learning and experience, right? You learn to recognize certain patterns of frequencies as your mother's voice or your friend's voice or the sound of a violin or the sound of a clarinet, right? That's a process of learning because, those aren't pure sounds. They have many frequencies in them at once, and there's particular patterns that you learn. That's what a piano sounds like. Okay, so that's temporal code. Okay, two other things I want to briefly mention. One of these is this idea of, well, how I said we can hear up to 20,000 hertz. How low can we hear? So we can hear speeds as low as 20 hertz all the way up to about 20,000 hertz. This is a very broad range of sounds that we can hear. But you might not be able to hear 20,000 hertz. In fact, I can't hear 20,000 hertz anymore. And by your mid-20s, you probably won't be able to hear them either, and maybe even lower. So I'll post a link in the video description of a hearing test where you can try playing some very high-frequency sounds. They're not very pleasant to listen to, but you can start, I think it starts around 8,000 hertz, goes on up to actually 22. You can see if you can hear it. And for me, after about 14,000 hertz, I can't hear it anymore. And this is fairly common as you age. So what happens is these hair cells at the base of the basilar membrane here essentially stop functioning properly. They get damaged, and you can't just grow new ones very easily. So essentially, if these are damaged, there's not much you can do. You just don't get to hear those sounds anymore. So you can try that out. Remember also, it's not a perfect test. The speakers that you're using or the headphones that you use will play a role in how well they can transmit sounds of those frequencies. But you can try it out and see how well your hearing is for those frequencies. And actually, this relates to some students use what are called mosquito ringtones. These are ringtones on their phone or notification sounds that are very, very high-pitched so that students can hear them, but teachers most likely can't because they're older and their ears aren't working quite as well. Not that I'm encouraging that kind of behavior. Okay, one final point is, why do we have two ears? Well, we have two of most things in our body. Right, we have this very symmetrical structure that doesn't really look like two. Right, we have this very symmetrical structure to our body. So why is it that we have two ears? Is it just to be symmetrical, or is there some other advantage to it? And you could probably figure out, if you thought about it for a second, that, yeah, of course there's an advantage to having two ears, beyond just, okay, if you injure one, you still have the other one. The other huge advantage is that you can now locate the direction of sounds. So two ears gives us a huge boost in directionality. Right. So when I make a noise over here, what's happening is it's hitting this ear slightly earlier than this ear, and it's louder in this ear than it is in this ear. And that tells me about the location that the sound is coming from. So if I were to close my eyes and you were to make noises around my head, it would be very easy for me to tell where the noise was coming from. And of course, if we think in evolutionary terms, there's a huge advantage to this. If you're wandering in the woods and you hear the sound of a predator behind you, well, you want to know what's behind you or in front of you or beside you, right? You want to immediately recognize the location of the sound. That's going to help you to escape. And so this is a big advantage. And it's something that happens. You don't have to think about it. You have to consciously say, okay, which ear did it get to first? Was it a little bit louder in this ear? It's an automated process. You hear a sound, you immediately know where it came from. Okay, so that's the basics of transduction for hearing. That's really all we're going to go into detail, all the detail we're going to go into for hearing. If you have further questions, maybe I can make a future video. But I hope you found this helpful. If so, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. Thanks for watching.